Okay. We are going to go, hopefully, in this session through two examples of typical Yerushalmi Sugyot, to give you a sense of the potential significance and the challenges of uh, learning them and utilizing them. The first is that I want to look at, because it is kind of uh, a relatively simple example just of the Yerushalmi style, is from Mishnah Sukkah 2:5. There are two relevant lines from the Mishnah. One, Shluchei mitzvah pturin min sukkah. So messengers, agents on their way to do a mitzvah are exempt from sukkah. And secondly, cholin u'mishamshehen, those who are ill and their caretakers are also pturim min sukkah. This is from the section of that chapter that goes through a series of people and situations when where one is exempt from sukkah, from eating in a sukkah during Sukkot. Now, just quickly, the Tosefta is both serves an illustration of the Tosefta's patterns and set us up to appreciate the Yerushalmi. The Tosefta has these two lines from the Mishnah, each with elaboration. This is where the Tosefta seems to be really functioning as a supplement. But the two additions are a little different from each other. The first, well, shluchei mitzvah p'turim min sukkah, but even though they said it's not so good to leave home during a festival. So the Tosefta adds kind of a caveat to the rule. And then it follows up with a story about Rabbi Eli, who went to see his teacher in Lod, and his teacher made fun of him for leaving home during a festival. Visiting your teacher who lives in a different city is considered a significant mitzvah, to which rabbis would go to great lengths. But his teacher says, actually, on a chag, that was a dumb thing to do. Now, that is about what is proper to do on chag, but it is not about the law of being exempt, of someone who is an agent for mitzvah, of whatever mitzvah that may be, being exempt. The second thing we see in the Tosefta, Cholinim Shamshehem, right? The sick and their caregivers are exempt from sukkah. The Tosefta says, lo cholem sukan, which means not only a sick person who's in danger, but even one who simply has a headache or an eye ache. Now, this is a clarification of halacha. When it says the sick, that doesn't only mean those who are critically ill. In other contexts, we talk about how sort of any even possible threat to life overrides everything. But so the Tosefta says, when we say the sick are exempt from sukkah, the point of saying that if it was just people who were deathly ill, we wouldn't need to bother saying that, because that's true of all mitzvot. But in terms of sukkah, even if you're only just not feeling great. And then it follows up with a story of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel, who recounts that he, in fact, had an eye pain, and his teacher, Rabbi Yossi, son of Rebbe, permitted him and his uh, caretakers to sleep outside of the sukkah exempted them from sukkah. So we have a rule and a clarification, and then a story of Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, who reports that, in fact, his teacher gave him and his caregivers exactly this permission. So we have these two statements in the Mishnah, on each of which the Tosefta has a significant elaboration. Okay, now here is the Yerushalmi on these same two lines. The Yerushalmi begins with its own story about Shulchei Mitzvah. Its story is about Rav Huna, who went to a town of Ein Tav for the proclamation of the new moon. Anything to do with setting the calendar was considered a very important and time-sensitive obligation of the rabbis, and joining a quorum to resolve set calendar issues is a frequent example of something that a rabbi would be doing that would take him away from his other obligations. So Rav Huna went to Ein Tav to participate in a classic mitzvah. He's certainly shluchei mitzvah, but although he was thirsty, he would not eat or drink anything until he'd gotten to the sukkah of Rabbi Yochanan of Gufta. So this story, which is clearly an Amoraic story, this is not a Talmudic source, and Rav Huna is an Amora, describes Rav Huna refusing to avail himself of this exemption. So we have, and now in this way, this story functions very much like stories in the Mishnah itself. A story in the Mishnah or the Tosefta may serve the function of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel's story, which is to illustrate a report that a halacha was in fact carried out in practice, and there's supporting, endorsing halacha, or it may come to problematize halacha, or as I think we touched on there's the famous example in the Mishnah in Brachot, where Rabban Gamliel says that a groom is exempt from Shema on the night after his wedding, but he himself refused to avail himself of that exemption on theological grounds. So the Mishnah contains the law and then the story of Rabban Gamliel himself, who taught the law, refusing to to uh, to to follow that exemption. So, in that sense, this story is in that style fits very much into the style of the Mishnah, the Tosefta, which is not surprising because the early Amoraim in Eretz Israel are very closely connected in time and space to the late Tanaim who put together those collections. Now, the next thing we need to see, that is all we have to say about Shulchei Mitzvah. Notice the material in the Tosefta about, it's not a great thing to do, and then the story does not appear here. In fact, the story about Rabbi Eli going to visit his teacher is quoted in the Yerushalmi, but only at the end of the Sugya, since essentially where the Tosefta simply links these two shluchei mitzvah and the general idea that one should try to stay home during the festival in one statement, the Yerushalmi, seeing them as conceptually two different ideas, breaks them apart. It talks about the shluchei mitzvah law, and then at the end of the section, after it has talked about the cholim and then another kind of related question, it then deploys this this story to treat the question of whether it's appropriate to leave home during Sukkot as kind of a related topic, as opposed to part of the Shluchei Mitzvah discussion. Indeed, once this story has been detached from the law of Shluchei Mitzvah, the Bavli takes that even further and moves this story. It still has the same story, it still serves the same function, but the Bavli moves it and attaches it to a later Mishnah in the Perek, which talks about how much, where it talks about whether one can fulfill one's obligation in another person's sukkah. So the Yerushalmi has a story about Rav Huna who did not accept this exemption, and then Amar Bimana seems to be a memra. Lo sof davar cholin shel sakana. Not only those who were dangerously ill, ela afilu cholin she'inan l'sakana. Even those who are not in danger. Now, interestingly, this is presented as a memra of an Rabbi Mana is an amora, but it is the exact same idea in the exact same place, right? The first comment on the rule about the sick, the exact same idea as the Tosefta, except that it's paraphrased. It's not the same language. This is not, on the one hand, this is one of those examples. We'll see another. This is one of those examples where the Yerushalmi is clearly using the Tosefta, and we know that even more clearly because it's immediately followed by the exact same story of Rabbi Shimon ben Gamliel that we find here in the Tosefta. So clearly these two lines are based on the Tosefta, but where the story is quoted in full and in the original language, the clarification of the rule is presented here in the Yerushalmi in the name of an Amora and in different wording. That doesn't sort of bring those specific examples. So, and that now, when you see these same sources they appear in the parallel Bavli, there's then a question and an answer and a discussion and a connection to larger issues. Yerushalmi, we've gone through two sugyot. On the Shluchei Mitzvah, Yerushalmi just has the one story of Rav Huna, and done. And if you read through, you're a little jarred. Then, regarding those who are ill, we have these two lines which are clearly based on the Tosefta, one paraphrasing, one quoting, done. That's a second sugya. We have many of such sugyot that are brief, they just make a point, they don't then weave together things or broader ideas. And then the third section. Now, Rabbi Ba Bar Zavda says now we have a memra, which teaches a halacha that is not in the Mishnah and is not in any Tannaitic source, but is closely related. So he teaches that the members of the wedding party, not only the couple, but all members of the wedding party, are exempt from Sukkah, um, meaning that the same principle. I mean, his Memra is based on the mission of the sick, right? He's applying the same principle. The sick and all of the sick person's caretakers are exempt from Sukkah, right? And importantly, the idea that it doesn't only apply to those who are critically ill, but even those who are a little bit ill, and therefore it's not about saving pikuach nefesh. We're not talking about saving a life. We're talking about discomfort, right? Um, they're exempted from sukkah if they're not going to be comfortable in the sukkah. That logic then is extended to the wedding party. It will feel awkward or uncomfortable um, for the wedding party for the couple, presumably who just got married, to spend the first night of their married life sleeping outside in a sukkah. And if we assume that the wedding party are the people who are celebrating with them over those next few days, um, they should all their their enjoyment and celebration of the wedding um, equals the discomfort of the sick person, and therefore we extend the lot. And finally, we have two stories of rabbis who were shushbinim, uh, I think an early Greek term for sort of wedding celebrants, right? Rabbi Mana was the shushbin for Rabbi Yaakov bar Yafliti, whoever that is. He went and asked his rabbi, his teacher, who said, "Go and sleep in the sukkah." And another Rabbi Yitzchak bar Marion asked his rabbi, who told him, "Go sleep in the sukkah." So what we have is a memra, which clearly states one uh, one the shushbinin and are all exempt from sukkah, and then two stories where students go to their teachers and ask about exactly this and are told you are not exempt, you should go sleep in the sukkah. So functions as a kind of machloket, even though it's not presented that way, because we have a rule, and then we have two stories where rabbis tell their students they should not follow this rule. Um, but again, that is the end of the sugya. We have now three little sugya pieces, each of which addresses a question and resolves it. Right? The thing that you'll, um, whether it um, comes with a resolution or um, leaves it complicated, there's no going back and forth about any or debating any of these issues. Right? The story of Rechuna comes to serve a definite function, to show a rabbi who was more machmir himself and did not avail himself of the exemption. Rabbi Mana's Memra and the story, which come from the Tosefta, clarify who counts as Holin and their caretakers in terms of being exempt from Sukkah. And then we have a related halacha um, extending the logic to Shushvinin, to the wedding celebrants, and two stories that again show rabbis, in this case not being strict on themselves, but seemingly actually telling their students that they should not follow that rule. And I will finally note that the two pieces that I just showed you at the end about the wedding party are actually, I actually skipped a couple of pieces, but I want to just show you what they are. So we had this memra of the rule about the wedding party being exempt. This is followed by a longer Tosefta, which offers which explains that those guarding a town or orchard are exempt, but not always depending on the circumstances. And after that Tosefta, the Yerushalmi offers us a story about a man who asks for and is not given permission to sleep outside the sukkah to guard his store. So we have a story of someone uh, who does not get permission to apply the exemption in the Tosefta to guarding his store. Then we get these two stories of um, people who are in wedding parties and their teachers do not give them permission to sleep outside of the sukkah, do not give them permission to follow Rabbi Bar Zavda's memra for whatever reason. And finally, the Yerushalmi quotes the Tosefta story that we saw connected to the first line of our Mishnah about the guy who travels to see his rabbi on the festival and is told that that was an inappropriate thing to do. So, just to recap. So the first thing I want you to notice is each of these units kind of is there are these discrete units that are all on topic and relevant, but not tied together in a single continuous conversation. I also want you to see how tightly organized this is. We start with uh, a, with a story directly on the issue of Shulchay Mitzvah. We follow with a clarification and story directly about the rule of the sick and their caretakers. So now we have the Yerushalmi first has the things that it wants to say directly about the rules in the Mishnah. Then we have a memra with a related rule about the wedding party. Um, that comes next probably because it is so close in language to the rule about those who are ill, followed by a Tosefta, which was presumably one of the sources that they had and wanted to include, because it is in Tosefta in this chapter and is relevant to this question specifically of exemptions from Sukkah. The Tosefta's, so the Tosefta's exemption for those guarding a town orchard. Then, so we have directly dealing with the two halachot in the Mishnah. Then we have present two related exemptions, one from a memra, one from the Tosefta, and then the Yerushalmi has now organized a series of stories, and they turn out, as it turns out, they are in kind of inverse order. It starts with the man who's not allowed to sleep outside of his store, which is sort of directly plays off of this Tosefta. And then we cycle back and we have a story about two rabbis who are not given permission to follow the rule about the wedding party, the previous. And finally, now we can kind of see more clearly why the Yerushalmi did this. we have the story about Rabbi Eli, about Rabbi Eli traveling to see his rabbi on Sukkot, which is a third, sort of kind of conceptual limitation on the rule that we saw, right? Agents for mitzvah are exempt technically, but you really shouldn't be going to do a mitzvah during Sukkot. Okay, um, okay, and the last thing, so we've seen that we have these simple units here. We've seen that overall this material is organized quite clearly and concretely, so we know where we stand at the end of each sugya or end of each little segment. The last thing I want to note is that most of this material is sources. And by sources, I mean Breitot, Memrot, stories that are clearly, uh, sort of fixed traditions, right? The kinds of sources that will get quoted in the Bavli and then analyzed, discussed, uh, elaborated on, etc. Are we really distinguish between the sources, which are usually relatively brief and sort of edited and set, and then this more discursive conversational material. But this story of Rav Huna is what we'd call a story source, right? Clearly a tradition about something someone did. These two lines, this is Rabbi Mana paraphrasing the Tosefta, and then a quote from the Tosefta. This is a simple memra telling giving a law, right, which is followed by the Tosefta, and the only kind of non-source material here is actually the explanation in the Gemara, elaborating on the Tosefta a little bit, and then we have these three stories, each of which are um, read as set traditions, ending, of course, with the Tosefta once again. So, yeah. And the last thing I will tell you before we conclude this kind of example um, is that almost all of this material is in the Bavli. This is one of those cases where the Bavli clearly had this whole sugya when it was sort of putting together the Bavli sugya. Some of the material has been changed, has been amended in small ways. Uh, some has been rearranged or moved around. There has been a great deal of elaboration. The Bavli Sugyot are somewhat longer, um, and they weave in and out, and they weave things together such that you don't necessarily get to the end of a sugya sort of clear about what point has been made, but most of the material in that sugya is kind of built around these building blocks. And these building blocks, in the way the Yerushalmi has laid them out, are clear and in an easily seen logical order. So what we have is a Yerushalmi that is more laconic, um, more kind of just making a point and then stopping, so it feels like each little piece is abrupt. You got this story, and then nothing telling me what the message of the story is, or discussing anything about the story, or anything. It's just the story's done. Move on to the new topic. Um, But seeing this simpler, more direct, more clearly structured section of Talmud is almost like a map to to make sense of what is otherwise a rather involved and complex and sometimes confusing Babli Sugya.